As we've been saying, it is official. The president acquitted by the Senate in its final impeachment vote today. So let's head out to our legal analyst one last time, at least one last time on impeachment, it seems. Here with me on set, defense attorney and NBC News legal analyst Danny Ceballos. Also joining us, former federal prosecutor and MSNBC legal analyst Cynthia Oxney. Cynthia, Danny, we were expecting an acquittal from the moment this impeachment process started, but I'd like to ask if either of you was surprised by anything today. Cynthia.
I wasn't surprised by anything. I think, many of us who have been watching have known that Romney had a core, which he displayed today beautifully and articulated what, we hope at some point will be the rebuilding of the Republican Party. It's very important for the country to have a functioning two-party system. And right now, the Republican Party has essentially collapsed to this cult of Trump. And, while Romney is going to get a lot of criticism from the Trumpers, at some point, he is the way forward for the Republican Party, and it's nice to see that core be displayed, something people can study and learn from and contrast with the Trumpers of today.
Danny, any surprises for you, or were you expecting that as well?
No surprises other than Romney and possibly the fact that the pages get so many shout-outs by the Senate. When I was an intern, nobody even cared if I was alive. But these pages are the subject of a lot of attention. They should feel very honored.
I don't think that's right, Danny.
Well, I have to
ask. Everybody loved you, Danny.
Look, when I was an intern, I'm not sure anybody even knew who I was. So the question is, are these pages that outstanding? Were we that bad? I mean, a question that I'll leave on the table. We don't have to officially answer that. Let me ask you this. There's been a lot of talk about whether the president needed to commit an actual crime to be removed from office. Does he, and does his acquittal now set a legal precedent that a U.S. president pressuring a foreign government to investigate a political opponent is not a crime?
No, and maybe I'm not alarmist enough, but I don't know that it sets a precedent, only because I maintain that prior impeachments have no precedential value whatsoever. Precedent is a concept in Article 3 courts. And what we've seen is that even in the two presidential impeachments we had prior to this, the first one of Andrew Johnson is scarcely precedential at all because there were such different cultures and norms back then. After all, one of the articles of impeachment ended up being making scurrilous, nasty speeches about other folks. That wouldn't be an impeachable offense today.
Could you imagine if it was?
Could you imagine?
Wow.
Exactly.
We'd be impeaching people left and right.
I think the big takeaway is, and maybe Cynthia will agree with me on this, but the big takeaway is that impeachment is a product of the right now. It may not have anything to do with history. Even just 20 years ago, the Clinton impeachment trial featured many differences, and it may be the case that there are so many differences, each trial is so unique that history is interesting but not really guiding in the end.
Cynthia, let me ask, do you agree with Danny there?
Well, I do think we have lowered the bar on what behavior is acceptable, not just through this impeachment, but through the whole presidency. What's acceptable in speeches, there's a coarsening that seems to be going faster and faster and faster with this president that I find very distressing. I do think there'll be a big time of study about these articles and this issue about whether or not you have to have an actual federal offense. My guess is that history will say, no, you do not. And there will also be a big study of this Alan Dershowitz argument that was, if the president thinks it's in the country's interest that he be reelected, nothing he does is impeachable. I think that will be roundly laughed at in legal and non-legal circles, and that's going to happen in the next couple of months.
Cynthia, Danny, I'm sorry, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I think the real challenge, what Cynthia's talking about, I think there's a related issue of the mixed motive issue as we move forward when presidents act. And you look at, and all I can compare it to is what I've defended as a criminal defense attorney. If I'm a government official and a contractor wants a contract, and I have the power to award that, if I give him that contract, half because I think he's a really good contractor, but the other half is because he gave me a bag of cash, well, that fact that half of it was because he was a good contractor isn't going to save me from criminal prosecution. So going forward, we have unanswered questions about what happens when the president acts with what's called mixed motives. And Alan Dershowitz really threw a monkey wrench into that analysis. And I do think Cynthia's right. That's an issue we'll be struggling with going forward because presidents always act with mixed motives, partly for the benefit of the country and partly for their own interest.
I would love to see how the law professors handle this one in the classrooms going forward. It's going to be very interesting. Cynthia, I sort of said in jest when I introduced you both that this might be the last time that we bring you in to talk about impeachment, but it may not be. House Manager Jerry Nadler saying he expects one of the House committees will subpoena John Bolton to testify. What legal options do the Democrats have going forward if they want to continue to investigate and try to get testimony?
Well, you know, in the trial, the president's attorney spent a lot of time basically taunting the Democrats for not following through on some of these earlier subpoenas and not going through the courts and not subpoenaing as many people as they should. And it looks like what's going to happen is they're going to call them on their bluff and start sending out subpoenas. I think they should. I think subpoenas should fly like lies from the president's mouth. And they should come from Engler, and they should come from Schiff, and they should come from Nadler, where there's Bolton to testify. There are all these documents in the Department of Justice that they've been withholding, OMB emails. Bolton has made a lot of accusations about Trump doing favors for autocrats. There are many things that need to be investigated, and the Congress needs to establish itself as an oversight body. It's essentially lost now, because they tried to enforce subpoenas and the president stiff-armed them, and they never got the information. And they have to reestablish that. And in addition to subpoenas, if I could say very quickly, I don't want to hog all the time, but in addition to the subpoenas, I really think they need to set up a legal structure as a way to enforce the subpoenas. I believe they need a dedicated court so that if somebody subpoenas something from the executive branch and the executive branch stiff-arms, there's a quick way to resolve that, not only in the initial resolution, but all the way up through the quick appellate process. Because otherwise, Congress is not an equal branch of government. And part of the strength of our system that keeps us from having any section overpower the other in our three branches is an ability of Congress to get information and do oversight. And that has been severely weakened by this president, and we need to reestablish it as an equal force.
Danny and Cynthia, thank you both so much, not only for being here with us today, you've been here throughout the inquiry, the trial. Thank you. I have a feeling we may be talking about this again in the future.
See you soon.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.